Greetings, students. I'm picking up right where I left off, continuing to look at pages 30 through 40 in your textbook by Stan Baronet. And I'm just going to pick it right up with another passage from the book and try to illuminate it and make it clearer to you through using the idea of universal form. So, in our book, the author writes, so far, we have been using letters to represent class terms. For example, we let D equal dog. We can now expand this technique to different types of statements. Let's compare the following two examples. All pizza toppings are delicious morsels. And if Sherry lives in Los Angeles, then Sherry lives in California. In example H, the two italicized words are called class terms. Concepts, right? Like we talked about in my first lectures, which by themselves are neither true nor false. However, the two italicized parts of example I are statements that are either true or false, and we can call them simple statements. In addition, example I contains the logical vocabulary words if and then. Example I is a good illustration of how a sentence in English can contain multiple simple statements. Taken as a whole, example I is what we call a compound statement, and it, too, is either true or false. And we can use letters to represent the simple statements in example I while we keep the logical vocabulary in place. For example, if we let L equal Sherry lives in Los Angeles and C equal Sherry lives in California, then we get the following example I. If L, then C. This technique can be applied to certain kinds of arguments. For example, in argument J. If Sherry lives in Los Angeles, then Sherry lives in California. Sherry lives in California, therefore Sherry lives in Los Angeles. And here he's made a little dictionary. He's going to let L stand for Sherry lives in Los Angeles, C stand for Sherry lives in California, and so we have if L, then C, C, therefore L. And here, as you can see, in addition to having the argument form, I've given us the universal form of the argument, as we've now learned how to do. If P, then Q, Q, therefore P. Now this is a conditional statement. The P, right, Sherry lives in California, is called the antecedent, and the Q, which follows the then, is the consequent. Now at this stage, the most important thing to recognize is that a conditional statement does not assert that either the antecedent or the consequent is true. What is asserted is that if the antecedent is true, then the consequent is true. Now given this understanding of a conditional statement, let's analyze argument J. We can start by assuming that the first premise is true. Why? Because it does not assert that Sherry actually lives in Los Angeles. It just asserts that if she lives in Los Angeles, then she lives in California. Now let's assume the second premise is also true, that Sherry lives in California. We can now ask, is the conclusion necessarily true? No, because it's possible that Sherry lives in San Francisco. Thus, argument J is invalid. The argument form for argument J is referred to as the fallacy of affirming the consequent. It is a formal fallacy, a logical error that occurs in the form of an argument, and formal fallacies are restricted to deductive arguments. So if we supplement our text and put it into universal form, if P then Q, Q therefore P, we can see the universal form of an invalid argument form, the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Now this means that any argument that has this form, that is an instance of this form, is invalid. Again, if you take symbolic logic with me, we'll learn how to prove that's invalid. Right? But for right now, all we can do is play with counterexamples. Right? But if whatever we put in, if we put in the same P and the same Q, it's going to be a bad argument. If it's a dog, then it's a mammal. It's a mammal, so it's a dog. See? A bad argument. So Baronet says, now let's look at another argument. He calls it argument K. If Sherry lives in Los Angeles, then Sherry lives in California. Sherry does live in California, therefore Sherry lives in California. And he gives us the argument form, if L then C, L therefore C, and now here I've put it into universal form. If P then Q, P therefore Q. Now this is a very famous argument form that's valid, right? It means that if the premises are true, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. And this one has a name that came down from the Middle Ages. It's called modus ponens. Actually, in the Latin, they called it modus ponendo ponens, which means the mode of argument that affirms by affirming. But nonetheless, whenever you have this, if you put in the same P's and the same Q's, right, you can trust that argument form. And again, in symbolic logic, we'll learn how to prove that, so you don't just have to take my word for it. Now Baronet asks us to look at a few more examples. He gives us argument M. If Sherry lives in Los Angeles, then Sherry lives in California. Sherry does not live in Los Angeles, therefore Sherry does not live in California. And that has the form, if L then C, it is not the case that L, it is not the case that C. Notice what he's done there. When we have the not, it means it's not the case that. And then we're going to abbreviate that in our universal form to just not. If P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. And this is an invalid argument form, right? And it's called the fallacy of denying the antecedent. See here, you're denying the antecedent of the conditional statement. So does the form if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q, right? I mean, obviously, Sherry could be living in Sacramento. She could be living in San Francisco. Just because she doesn't live in Los Angeles doesn't mean she doesn't live in California. So that's a really bad argument. Now, it looks pretty plain here when you see it like that, but the reason we're studying this and practicing such simple examples is you got to watch out, because people will throw these things at you really quick, all mixed up, not in standard form, and try to convince you of things. And if you take time, slow down, and pick it apart, you can find out that in this great rush of words that the politicians or whoever throws at you, you're being presented with what basically is something as ridiculous as this. Now Baronet gives us argument N. If Sherry lives in Los Angeles, then Sherry lives in California. Sherry does not live in California, therefore Sherry does not live in Los Angeles. Now this has the argument form, if L then C, it's not the case that C, therefore it's not the case that L, which gives us the universal form, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And this is called modus tollens, right? And it's a valid argument form. Its form is, if P then Q, not P. And any argument that is a substitution instance of this universal form is a valid argument form, right? If it's raining, then it's wet. It's not raining, it's not wet. Right? If it's raining, then it's wet. It's not wet, so it's not raining. Pay attention. Right? If it's snowing, then it's cold. It's not cold, it's not snowing, and so on. Now, you don't want to confuse the following, because notice, they're very close to each other, and students are always mixing these up. And sure as all get out, I'm going to tell you not to confuse the following. And on our first exam, some of you will confuse it. But now that's happened for 25 years every year, but every year I have great hope that this will be the first time that there is not a student in my logic class who confuses these two. Notice the difference. If P then Q, not P not Q, versus if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Plug in some different things into the P's and Q's until you're satisfied that this is a bad argument and this is a good one, and you shouldn't confuse them. Now we have another argument, and I think on an exam, just to talk about that for a minute, I could give you an argument. I'll say, I'm going to give you an argument. Give me its argument form, then give me its universal form, and tell me what it is. In other words, you should be able to recognize this as a hypothetical syllogism and that it's valid. We'll talk about some more of that soon, real soon, because this is all over in 18 days. Holy cow. Anyway, here, if Sherry lives in Los Angeles, then Sherry lives in California. If Sherry lives in California, then Sherry lives in the United States. If Sherry lives in Los Angeles, then Sherry lives in the United States. So we let L, we should have a dictionary. If you did it on an exam, I'd want you to put a dictionary. We'd say, let L equals Sherry lives in Los Angeles. Let C equals Sherry lives in California. And let U equals Sherry lives in the United States. If L, then C. If C, then U. If L, then U. And this is called the hypothetical syllogism and is a valid argument form. If P, then Q. If Q, then R. If P, then R. Any substitution instance of this will be valid. And next, Professor Baronet asks us to consider argument Q, right? Sherry lives in Los Angeles or Sherry lives in San Francisco? Sherry does not live in Los Angeles, therefore Sherry lives in San Francisco, which he translates into argument form as L or S. It's not the case that L, therefore S. Now this can come in two forms, right? You could say L or S, it's not the case that L, therefore S, or you could say L or S, it's not the case that S, therefore L. And that gives us two forms, which are called disjunctive syllogism. And it's a valid argument form, a very simple one. Anyway, a disjunctive syllogism is a valid argument form. P or Q, not P, then Q, and P or Q, not Q, then P. Now at this point, you might be feeling like this guy, Bill the cat. There's a lot of stuff at you coming at you really quick, and we're moving really fast. And there's a lot of videos for you to write, stuff for you to look at, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, and you're at home, or you're on campus, or you're, well, we're all just freaking out, aren't we? And I understand that. But what I want to tell you is that you just need to keep calm and Jedi on, like my man Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon Jinn is perhaps my favorite Jedi, who followed the path of the living force. And I think if we just calm down and try to be mindful and think about things, and of course just work hard, that's part of it too. You have to work hard. You have to spend a lot of time on this, and you have to practice it and do it over and over again. It's no small thing, excuse me. It's no small thing to learn to think about thinking. So may the Force be with you. I'll be coming at you soon with some more videos. But remember to keep calm and Jedi on.